Hello, hello. Welcome to another episode with Bobby. You're on Mulholland Drivethru channel. And today I'm going to talk about something a little bit different. I'm going to do a theme video, and the first theme I'm going to cover I've chosen to be childhood favourites. Thought this might be a good way to sort of introduce a little bit of my like where I'm coming from in this channel. I think what we listen to in our early years often sets up some kind of parameters for how we interpret future listening experiences. So I'm going to talk about 10. I've chosen 10 albums from my youth that I was enamored with from a very young age growing up, and I've drawn the line at 12. I'm going to talk about music that I loved until I was 12. I might cover the teenage years in another episode, but for now I thought, let's stick to childhood and go from there later. One of the earliest memories I still have when I was very young is flicking through my parents' very sort of small record collection. They probably only had about maybe 20 or 30 records, but I can still smell the plastic sleeves. Not just because there's plastic sleeves sitting on the desk here, but I'm talking this nostalgic pang I get sort of thinking about that memory. I can really experience it all over again when I think about flicking through their really pretty small, pretty dodgy, it has to be said, record collection. But somehow it was enough for me to pick up the fact that people could have a collection of music and you could decide to put what music on when you felt like it, and that was, I guess, important. And it led pretty quickly to making my own decisions musically about what I would decide to put on, or what I wanted to buy, or my parents to buy me when I was very young. And so, I got pretty obsessed pretty quickly with music, as this list will attest. It was sort of hard to whittle down my childhood to 10 albums, but this is the ones I've chosen. I'm going to do it chronologically. Sorry, I shouldn't say chronologically. I should say autobiographically. I'm going to sound like a total wanker, like John Cusack from High Fidelity. The albums, as you'll see, were released at various times, but this is the order in which I was exposed to them. So I'm going to begin with probably a lot of people's first album, MJ's Thriller. This is actually the 25th anniversary edition, which I picked up. It must have been in 2006 or 7 when it came out. Look, this was such again, one of my earliest memories was walking through a department store in the early 80s and seeing the cassette. It was a cassette which I sort of begged my parents to buy for me because I'd heard some tracks on the radio, obviously. You couldn't escape Thriller back in the early 80s. It came out in 82. And so I must have been 4. I was born in 78. It came out 4 years later. And I've got such a vivid memory of just being absolutely obsessed with not only the album, but Michael Jackson himself. That documentary that came out around that time called The Making of Thriller. We hired that from the video store probably every week for about a year. I had to just keep watching it. I thought, this is the best thing that exists in the whole universe. It's such a meticulous album. It's such a brilliant pop album. I mean, it's not a coincidence that many people hold it up to be, the definitive pop album. And I guess I count myself pretty lucky that it came out when I was young and impressionable and, probably had very similar experiences to other 4-year-olds or children around 1982. What's even more amazing is I still put it on every now and then, and I still think it's incredible. you'd be mad not to. It's Michael Jackson's Thriller. Yes, there's some daggy things on here. The Girl Is Mine with McCartney must rank as one of the daggiest songs that's ever been recorded by anyone ever at any period in time. But who cares? It's Michael Jackson and Paul McCartney. There's some severely overlooked songs, I think. Like Thriller, most people think is all about the singles, like, Want to Be Starting Something and, the title track, Beat It, Billie Jean. But tracks like Human Nature or PYT, Baby Be Mine, even the final track, The Lady in My Life, these are all, every song is just its own icon, I suppose. Props to Thriller, props to Quincy and Michael for putting together probably one of the most complete and perfect pop albums ever. It's what got me into music from a very young age, and I'm very thankful for that experience, I suppose. I'm going to fast forward a few years. Of course, I didn't just listen to Thriller for 4 years, but I'm going to fast forward to 1986. And this is very embarrassing. This is kind of closet of shame material. But if you were growing up in Australia in 1986, as I was 8, so please keep that in mind. You basically couldn't ignore John Farnham. John Farnham is and was, probably remains and will be forevermore, one of Australia's music icons for various unknown reasons, really. But he does have a supremely good voice, but his choice of material from an adult perspective is often a little bit flawed. But yeah, look, I was 8. I'm going to stop defending my 8-year-old self. And his comeback album called Whispering Jack was, I guess, like Thriller. You couldn't escape it back in the mid-80s. And it was almost like every Australian household had to own this album. I'm not sure how much or how well it did overseas. So if you live overseas and you've ever listened to Whispering Jack by John Farnham, please leave me a comment, because I'd be really interested to hear if anyone who's not Australian, A, has heard it, and B, what do you think of it? It's something I picked up for $2 a few years back, purely for sentimental reasons. This is not the original copy my family owned back in the day. The original copy was probably thoroughly scratched from overplaying it. But such was the mid-80s in Australia. Similarly, I think this came out the following year, Icehouse's Man of Colours. Icehouse probably did a little bit better than Farnham internationally. Icehouse is an Australian band. I think they've had a few hits overseas, possibly in Europe. Man of Colours is probably their most successful album in Australia. Again, it was very big, it was prominent, it was on commercial radio, that's what my parents listened to. And thus I became an Icehouse convert. This is still a pretty good album, I reckon. Ivor Davies is the lead singer and songwriter in the band, and he is still playing shows and touring as Icehouse and all those things. And look, his 80s material was very, I guess, Bowie-esque. He vocally sounds a lot like Bowie, and he's a really good songwriter. Yes, they're poppy, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. This album has some pretty great pop songs on it. Crazy, Electric Blue, which he co-wrote with either Hall or Oates. I can never remember which, but it was one of the Hall and Oates team he co-wrote Electric Blue with. The title track is great. Yeah, look, I was, 9 at this stage, so my 9-year-old self loved Icehouse's Man of Colours. So my 9-year-old self obviously was fairly eclectic, because at the same time I really got into Guns N' Roses. A couple of my schoolmates, I think, were into Guns N' Roses at the time, and so I Caught the Bug, and of course Appetite for Destruction was, you know, incredibly successful, and you couldn't escape this one either. And I guess this was my first experience with what my childhood self considered to be, you know, adult music. It was loud, it was heavy, it was in your face. Photos of the band made me feel slightly threatened. You know, they had that sort of hair metal, hard rocking thing going, which for some reason young boys find incredibly appealing. And so, you know, Appetite for Destruction went on quite a bit. It made me feel cool when I listened to it, but I guess that's still the case with a lot of adults these days. You know, it's a cool album, man. Hit after hit after hit. Great playing throughout. Axl's voice is on fire throughout, and Slash's guitar is also on fire. You know, it's one of the greatest hard rock albums ever, as far as I'm concerned. So, you know, props to my 9-year-old self for loving Appetite for Destruction. And this sort of introduces an interesting phase of my childhood where I went through my metal phase pretty early. So once I got into the Gunners, the next album, which was significant, I think I was 10 when this came out, Metallica's And Justice for All. I was too young for their previous few releases. I didn't really get into, you know, Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets or Kill Them All until much later, actually. But it was Justice that sort of first presented Metallica to my young and impressionable ears. And I have vivid memories again of watching an old show on the ABC here called The Afternoon Show. And the host of The Afternoon Show premiered, I think, the video for the song One. This was on at like 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon where, you know, the kids are at home, they're playing, mum's preparing dinner or whatever, and they play the video for One. If you've never seen the video for One, I suggest that you look at it after this video. It's basically a graphic depiction of the lyrics of the song, which describe something fairly horrific for a 10-year-old. You know, someone who's been completely annihilated in a war, and he's lost all of his limbs, and he's just this sort of vegetable waiting to die. And you see this, you know, vegetable-looking person on a hospital bed, and it's very confronting. It probably gave me nightmares for about a year, but of course I also thought I was very cool by listening to such a nightmarishly heavy track, you know, at that sort of age. And I think it was probably Lars Ulrich's drums on that which got me into drumming as well. The sixth tuplet on the kick drum during the middle breakdown section. You know, it was pretty heavy and cool when you were 10. So props to Justice. And I think the following year, it's kind of embarrassing, but the Crew's Dr. Feelgood, Motley Crue, man, they were probably my biggest, you know, hard rock crush at the time. You know, I think I wanted to change my name to Vince when I was, you know, sort of that age, 11. I just thought Vince Neil was like the coolest guy in the universe, and I didn't want my name anymore. So, you know, that's how much I loved Motley Crue at that age. These days, I think of Dr. Feelgood as just a great pop album. I mean, it's, you know, it's not very heavy. They're just really poppy, melodic, bouncy songs, which, you know, I think are fairly well produced on this album. I think it's Bob Rock, isn't it? Bob Rock produced it, and he did a great job. It just sounds like a really cool pop album. It's lost all of its, you know, dangerous connotations which I gave it back in the day. And so sometimes, I sort of fairly shamefully put the record on when no one's at home, and it still feels pretty good. So Dr. Feelgood. And for my birthday that year, I think, and this was 1989 we're talking about now, must have been my 11th birthday, someone gave me the cassette of Faith No More's The Real Thing. It's probably my first brush with alternative rock, if you like. I'm not sure how alternative Faith No More would be considered these days. Maybe they still are. But yeah, based on my friend's recommendation, I started listening to that tape, and it pretty much got chewed up over the next year or so. And I think it's a great album. The Real Thing is a fantastic album. Obviously, the hit that everyone remembers is Epic. We still don't know what it is after all these years, but maybe that's why it's so successful. But it's got some great songs on it. The whole first half is just killer. From Out of Nowhere, Epic, Falling to Pieces, Surprise You're Dead, Zombie Eaters. And side 2 is a little bit more surreal. I still love the title track, Underwater Love, especially Woodpecker from Mars. They were a great band, Faith No More. They put that album fairly recently, a few years ago. I guess they may or may not still exist, but back in the day, they were incredibly good. So very fond memories of The Real Thing. And now we're going to 1990, and I was 12, and I remember, I think one of my parents got this for Christmas or a birthday or something. They got it on CD, but I probably listened to it a lot more than they did. The Very Best of Elton John. It was this very compilation, and this compilation got me into Elton in a big way. I had to go and basically explore his whole discography after hearing this compilation. I'd heard him on the radio, I think. I'd probably heard like Rocket Man and Candle in the Wind and stuff, but I'd never sort of listened properly, and never, visited his, his back catalogue in any kind of serious way until then. And that began a massive interest in his music. To the degree where these days I don't think about the hits when I think of Elton. I think about the deep cuts, the ones that are only on the albums, and the ones that usually don't get on the radio at all. The first decade or so of his music, probably slightly less than a decade, until about 1977, every single album was just absolutely brilliant as far as I'm concerned. That was incredibly important to hear the compilation first. It's the way a lot of people get into a lot of artists, I suppose. You listen to a best of compilation, you go from there. Love Elton still. The hits are fantastic. He's one of the greatest pop writers ever, as far as I'm concerned. But that's no reason to ignore his vast back catalogue. Certainly the 70s stuff is very impressive. And another piano man as well. Same time, I think someone gave me this when I was around that age, about 12. It's Billy Joel's Greatest Hits Volumes 1 and 2. I know Billy's not very cool. I know he's not very cool. He's never been very cool. But, when you're a kid, you don't really know or care what's cool. You just know or care about what your ears like. And my ears really loved Billy Joel. Again, the compilation introduced me to his whole career, and I went back and I listened to those early albums and fell in love with all of them, really. That continued, and I'd still say I really like Billy. I don't listen to Billy very much these days, but I don't think there's any denying that he's a brilliant songwriter, great musician, excellent arranger. His albums now seem very almost quaint. Like there's no real production as we know that word today. It's just the sound of, his band playing the songs, and not too much in terms of, effects or any production techniques really. And that should be, I think, respected. People used to not have much to play with in that regard, and they had to compensate with musical playing ability, and Billy is one of the best in that regard, I think. So yes, Billy Joel. Finally, and I feel like this is sort of bordering now on my teens. I was 12 when I received this for Christmas, so it must have been like 12 and a half, like just before I became a teenager. And my parents gave me the Beatles' Blue album for Christmas. They gave it to me on CD, but of course I had to buy the vinyl a while back. And I've still got the CD actually. Look, what can I say? This was the first time I'd really been introduced to the Beatles in a sort of real way, where I could sit down and put them on and listen intently, which I think needs to be done with the Beatles, certainly their second period, the sort of the Blue album period as opposed to the Red album period. I'm so glad that my parents chose the Blue album, because I'm far more fascinated with their Pepper onwards phase than I am with their Mop Top stuff. That's not to say I don't love that stuff as well, but for me, really sort of Revolver or Rubber Soul onwards is the Beatles as far as I'm concerned. So this Blue album introduced me to that period of Beatles. And I can still remember listening to A Day in the Life for the first time, and the orchestral crescendo in the middle and at the end just blew me away the first time I heard that. I'd never heard anything like that until then. And songs like Strawberry Fields, Penny Lane, like all that Pepper era stuff just sort of changed how I listen to music from that point onwards. I think you sort of realize what people are competing with now, like, oh, this is what people are trying to sort of do better than. Ever since the Beatles did this, they're trying to, that's the benchmark. So yeah, look, what's to be said is the Beatles' Blue album. It's one of the best compilations I think I've ever heard. I'm so pleased that it was a great choice of present from my parents. It sort of set up my taste, I think. I think from that point onwards, I sort of realised, right, so the Beatles are the best band in the world. That's a fact. So from now on, this is the measure, is it as good as the Beatles? And, I guess after that point, my taste went in all sorts of directions based on, but I guess based in many ways on the 10 that I've chosen today, but especially the Beatles, I think. Yeah, that's my 10. So I hope that was, entertaining for someone somewhere. Would love to hear your 10. If you want to list 10 of your own favourites till the age of 12 in the comments, that would be really cool. Maybe tell me how old you are, or at least, ish, so I can kind of place, okay, you grew up in this decade, so this is what you listen to in that decade, because otherwise it's hard to contextualise.